Get out and never come back!
Please let me stay.
Get out and take your brat with you! And take this garbage with you too!
The porch light was off. That was the detail Dorothy Hale would remember most clearly in the weeks that followed, long after the rain had stopped and the cold had finally left her bones. Because a porch light left off is such a small thing, such a forgettable thing, until it becomes the moment you understand exactly where you stand in your own family. She stood on the top step of the house her husband had built with his own hands 41 years earlier, her cardigan soaked through to the skin beneath it, her silver hair plastered flat against her forehead, and beside her, pressed so tightly into her side that she could feel the girl trembling through 2 layers of wet fabric, stood 8-year-old Lily, her granddaughter. The only person left in this world who still looked at Dorothy the way people used to look at her before she got old. Enough to become inconvenient. Behind the door, warm yellow light spilled from every window of the house, and laughter drifted out into the freezing rain. Laughter that belonged to people who knew exactly who was standing outside and had decided, quite deliberately, not to open the door. This is the night everything Dorothy Hale believed about her own family came apart. Not slowly. Not with the kind of warning a person can prepare for. It came apart the way a rope comes apart after years of quiet fraying. One thread giving way after another until suddenly, without ceremony, there is nothing left holding 2 people together at all. She had raised her son in that house. She had rocked him to sleep in the very room where the laughter was now coming from, had bandaged his knees in that kitchen, had sat up nights with him when he was sick, had given up things she never spoke about so that he could have things she never had. And on a night when the temperature had dropped low enough to turn her breath into fog, when her granddaughter's small fingers had gone numb inside her own, that same son had let the phone ring itself into silence 3 times, without once walking to the door. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Dorothy had not always been a woman who stood outside locked doors. Before she had ever been anyone's grandmother, before she had even been anyone's mother, she had been a 19-year-old girl standing in the doorway of a small tailor shop on the edge of town, watching a young man named Walter Hale argue, gently and with far too much patience, over the price of a coat he could not really afford. She had not meant to fall in love with him that afternoon. She had simply noticed the way he spoke to the old shopkeeper, without a trace of the impatience most young men carried into transactions like that, asking after the man's arthritis before he ever asked about the price. She married him 2 years later in a church that no longer stands. In a dress she had sewn herself out of fabric her own mother had saved for a decade. And when Walter carried her over the threshold of the half-finished house he had been building with borrowed lumber and Sunday afternoons, he told her that every board in that house would remember her name long after both of them were gone. She had laughed at him then, young enough still to think a house was only a house. It took them 6 years to finish that home properly, Walter working double shifts at the plant during the week and framing walls on Saturdays, Dorothy holding the lantern some nights so he could see well enough to finish a door frame before the light gave out completely. She remembered, decades later, standing in the kitchen the night the final wall went up, watching Walter run his hand along a support beam the way another man might touch a piano, and she remembered thinking, in that unguarded moment, that she had never once doubted this man would keep every promise he ever made to her. It was that memory, more than any other, that made the locked door so many years later feel less like a betrayal by her son and more like a betrayal of the house itself, of every plank Walter had cut and sanded with his own 2 hands, so that his family would always have somewhere warm to come home to. 6 months before the storm, she had still lived inside that house as its rightful matriarch, still moved through its rooms with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every corner of it, still hummed old hymns while she stood at the stove making dinner for a family that once, she believed, could not have survived a single ordinary Tuesday without her. She had taught Lily to thread a needle at that same kitchen table, guiding small fingers with the patience of a woman who had spent 30 years as a seamstress, mending other people's lives one stitch at a time before she ever understood she would need to mend her own family the same way. Walter's old reading chair still sat by the window then, worn soft in the exact shape of him, and some mornings Dorothy caught herself setting his coffee cup down beside it out of habit before remembering, all over again, that grief does not ask permission before it visits. It had begun so quietly that Dorothy almost missed it entirely, the way illness sometimes announces itself only after it has already taken hold. Her son Thomas had married a woman named Sharon 9 years earlier, a woman with sharp opinions and a sharper sense of what a life was supposed to look like. And for years Dorothy had told herself the distance she felt from her daughter-in-law was simply the ordinary distance between two women who loved the same man differently. But somewhere in the last year, that distance had curdled into something else, something Dorothy did not yet have language for, something that revealed itself first in small comments over dinner about how tired Dorothy seemed lately, how forgetful she had become, how perhaps it was time to start thinking about what came next. Dorothy had laughed those comments off the way a person laughs off a threat they are not yet ready to name as one. There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, in the moments when a woman realizes she has been talking for several minutes and no one at the table is listening, in the pamphlets for assisted living facilities left carelessly on the kitchen counter where she was certain to see them, in the way her own son began addressing questions to his wife that used to be addressed directly to his mother, as though Dorothy's opinion on her own life had quietly stopped mattering to anyone but herself. She noticed all of it. She said nothing about most of it, because the alternative was to admit that the family she had built her entire identity around raising might no longer want her in the way she needed to be wanted, and there are some truths a mother will avoid for as long as her heart allows her to. Lily noticed things too, the way children notice things adults believe are hidden from them. She noticed that her grandmother's chair at dinner had quietly moved further from the center of conversation with each passing month. She noticed that her father's voice changed when he spoke to his mother now, thinner somehow, apologetic in a way that never used to be there. She noticed, most of all, the folder her grandfather had left behind in the hallway closet, tucked beneath a stack of old quilts, marked in his careful handwriting with only 3 words. For Lily. Only. Dorothy had found it months after Walter's funeral and had never once opened it, telling herself she was not yet ready, though some quieter part of her suspected the truth was closer to fear than readiness. What Dorothy did not know, and would not learn until much later, was that Thomas had not slept properly in nearly a year before that rainy night on the porch. His investment in a friend's shipping venture, one he had entered into quietly without telling either his mother or his father while Walter was still alive, had collapsed 18 months earlier, taking with it nearly all of the savings he and Sharon had built over a decade of careful work. The night Thomas told his father about the shipping venture, he had rehearsed the conversation for nearly 2 weeks beforehand, standing in his own bathroom mirror running through versions of the same sentence until none of them sounded any less humiliating than the last. Walter was 73 that year, still sharp enough to run numbers in his head faster than Thomas could pull them up on a phone, and when Thomas finally sat down across from him at the same kitchen table where every important conversation in that family seemed to happen, he noticed his father's hands were steady in a way his own were not. He told Walter everything in the end, because he had learned long ago that his father could smell a half-truth the way other men smelled rain coming. He told him about the friend from college who had come to him with numbers that looked too good to argue with, about the $200,000 he had quietly moved out of savings without telling Sharon the full amount, about the ship that never left port because the company behind it had been built on paperwork that did not hold up to the first hard look anyone gave it. He told him the money was gone, all of it, and that he did not know how he was going to explain this to his wife, to his daughter, to himself. Walter did not raise his voice. He never had, not once in all the years Thomas had known him, and that had always been somehow worse than yelling, because a raised voice at least gave a son something to push back against. Instead, Walter sat in silence for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular calm of a man who has already decided how he intends to respond before the conversation ever began. He told Thomas that he would cover the loss, quietly, without telling Dorothy the details, because he did not want her carrying the weight of a decision that was never hers to make. But he told him this only once, he said, and he wanted Thomas to understand exactly what he meant by that. He reminded Thomas of something he had told him as a boy, standing in the half-finished frame of the house they were building together, back when Thomas was young enough to still think his father could fix anything with his hands. Walter had told him then that a house built too quickly falls just as quickly, that every board he was nailing into place would only hold weight because he had taken the time to measure twice before he ever cut once. He told Thomas now, decades later, that money worked the same way, that chasing something quickly almost always meant building on ground that had never been properly measured, and that he was frightened, more frightened than he had let himself admit out loud, that his son had inherited his own stubbornness without inheriting the patience that was supposed to balance it out. Thomas had argued, that night, that this was different, that he understood the risk now, that it would never happen again. Walter had listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Thomas finished, he had said only one more thing before rising from the table to signal the conversation was over. He said that he loved him completely, that this would not change between them no matter what came next, but that love did not mean he trusted him blindly, and that trust, once shaken, was a different thing entirely from love, something that had to be rebuilt slowly through years of small, consistent choices rather than restored all at once through a single difficult conversation. It was that same night, unbeknownst to Thomas at the time, that Walter had gone to his study and quietly begun drafting the amendments to Lily's trust, not out of anger, and not even primarily out of distrust of his son, but out of a father's particular grief at watching history repeat itself in a shape he recognized all too well from his own younger years, when he too had once made a reckless decision his own father had quietly absorbed the cost of without ever fully trusting him again in the same way. Walter had promised himself, sitting alone at his desk that night with the lamp burning low, that he would not make the same mistake his own father had made, leaving protection only to trust and never to paper, and that whatever came next for his son, his granddaughter's future would not be left vulnerable to the same pattern he had just watched Thomas nearly repeat. He never told Thomas what he had done that night. He carried it quietly for the remaining years of his life, choosing action over explanation, protection over confrontation, and it was only in the letter he left behind for Harold to deliver if it ever became necessary, that any of it finally came to light, long after Walter himself was no longer there to soften the truth for the son who had to read it. The debt found Thomas again 8 months after his father's funeral, larger this time, arriving in the form of a business partner who was no longer interested in patience. Sharon had been the one to suggest the trust modification, framing it in the softest possible language, a way to free up equity in the house without Dorothy ever needing to know the full extent of what that equity was being used for. Thomas had told himself, in the weeks that followed, that this was simply borrowing against something that would eventually belong to him anyway, that his mother would never be harmed by paperwork she barely understood in the first place. He had told himself this so many times that by the night of the storm, he had almost managed to believe it, right up until the moment his own mother stood outside in the freezing rain, and he found himself unable to walk to the door, because some smaller, still honest part of him already knew that opening it meant facing what he had allowed to happen in order to protect a debt he was too ashamed to name out loud. The night the locks changed came without warning, though Dorothy would spend weeks afterward searching backward through every recent conversation for a sign she might have missed. Sharon had mentioned, almost in passing, that the house needed some renovations, that it might be easier for everyone if Dorothy and Lily stayed somewhere else for a few days while the work was done, and Dorothy, wanting so badly to believe there was still a version of her family that simply loved her without complication, had agreed without asking the questions she should have asked. She had taken Lily to visit an old friend across town, had returned 3 days later expecting warm light and familiar smells, and had found instead a key that no longer turned in a lock that no longer belonged to her. She had knocked first with the patience of a woman who assumed a mistake had been made, certain that within moments the door would open and Thomas would apologize for some misunderstanding about timing. She had knocked a second time when the rain began, harder now, her granddaughter's hand growing colder inside her own with every passing minute. She had called the house phone and heard it ring 3 separate times before finally going silent, the kind of silence that is its own kind of answer. And she had knocked a third time, standing directly beneath a porch light that should have clicked on the moment darkness fell, a porch light that Thomas himself had installed on a motion sensor years earlier specifically so his mother would never again have to stand outside in the dark, only to realize, slowly and with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, that someone inside that house had made a very deliberate choice to turn it off. What Dorothy Hale did not know, standing there in the rain with her granddaughter pressed against her side, was that the very people who might change everything were, at that exact moment, only a few dozen feet away, behind a different door entirely, in a house where the porch light was very much still on. Harold Whitman had spent 38 years as an estate attorney before retiring to the quiet street where he and his wife Carol now lived 3 doors down from the Hale family. And in all those years of reading contracts and reviewing wills for a living, he had developed an instinct for the particular silence that surrounds a family hiding something, a silence he had noticed, without quite understanding why, drifting from the Hale house in recent months. He was standing at his own front window that night, watching the rain streak sideways across the glass, when he saw 2 figures huddled beneath the neighboring porch, and something in the stillness of that older woman's posture, something in the way she held the small child against her rather than reaching again for the door, told him immediately that this was not confusion. This was abandonment, happening in real time, in the freezing rain, 3 houses down from where he stood. He did not hesitate the way a younger man might have hesitated, weighing whether it was his place to intervene in a neighbor's private affairs. He had spent decades watching families destroy themselves over money and pride, watching good people talked out of their own better instincts by relatives who wanted something and had convinced themselves they deserved it, and something about the shape of that scene on the porch, the locked door, the porch light gone dark, the utter stillness of a woman who had clearly given up knocking, told him this story had already been unfolding for longer than one rainy night. He called for Carol, grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, and walked out into the storm toward 2 strangers he had exchanged nothing more than polite nods with in passing, because whatever was happening on that porch, he intended, before the night was over, to understand every piece of it. Carol reached the porch first, moving with the particular urgency of a woman who has raised 3 children of her own and recognizes the specific fragility of a small girl standing in weather she should never have been left in. She wrapped a blanket she had grabbed from her own hallway closet around Lily's shoulders before she had even finished crossing the yard, murmuring reassurances in the low, steady voice she had once used to calm her own children through nightmares, while Harold stood at the base of the steps, his eyes fixed not on the porch but on the house itself, on the warm light glowing behind curtained windows, on the unmistakable outline of people moving inside who had every reason to know their own. Mother was standing outside in a storm and had chosen, for reasons Harold did not yet understand, to let her stand there. Dorothy tried, in that first moment, to protect the only dignity she had left. She insisted she was fine, that this was simply a misunderstanding about timing, that her son would surely be down any moment to explain everything and let them back inside where it was warm. But even as she spoke the words, Harold watched something in her face falter, watched the practiced calm of a proud woman begin to crack under the weight of a truth she was no longer able to talk herself out of. And when Lily, still shivering beneath Carol's blanket, said quietly that she had heard her father's voice from behind the door and he had not come, Dorothy's carefully maintained composure broke entirely. And for the first time that night, in front of two strangers who had done nothing but offer kindness, she allowed herself to cry. It was in that moment, standing on a stranger's porch in the freezing rain with her granddaughter's blanket-wrapped shoulders shaking against her side, that Dorothy Hale understood something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The family she had built everything around, the son she had raised with her own two hands, the house her husband had built board by board, had all quietly decided, somewhere in the last several months, that she no longer belonged inside it. But standing directly in front of her, having crossed a rain-soaked yard for no reason other than the simple fact that it was the right thing to do, were two people who had never met her before that night, and who had already decided, without a single word of hesitation, that this was not going to stand. Harold walked Dorothy and Lily back to his own home that night, refusing to let either of them so much as glance again at the house they had just been shut out of. And it was inside his warm kitchen, over tea Carol brewed without being asked, that the full weight of the evening finally settled over Dorothy, like a blanket she could not shrug off. She sat at a stranger's table with her hands wrapped around a cup she could not bring herself to drink from, and when Harold gently asked her how long this had been building, she found herself, for the first time in months, telling the truth out loud, instead of quietly bearing it alone. She told him about the comments over dinner, about the pamphlets on the counter, about the way Sharon had begun speaking about her in the third person, as though Dorothy were no longer present enough to be spoken to directly. She told him about the folder in the hallway closet that she had never opened, and when she said the words "for Lily only," something shifted behind Harold's eyes, the sharp, immediate attention of a man whose entire career had trained him to recognize the particular shape of a document someone did not want discovered. He asked her, carefully, whether she had ever seen a lawyer review the paperwork when the house was placed into a family trust 2 years earlier. Dorothy admitted, with a shame she had not expected to feel, that she had simply signed where Thomas told her to sign, trusting her own son the way a mother trusts a child she raised to be honest. That single admission was enough for Harold to understand that whatever had happened that night on the porch was very likely not a spontaneous cruelty, but the visible edge of something that had been arranged, carefully and deliberately, over a much longer stretch of time. He did not say this to Dorothy directly, not yet, unwilling to hand her a fear she could not yet do anything about. Instead, he simply asked if she would allow him to look into the paperwork on her behalf, as a retired attorney, and, he added gently, as a neighbor who had no intention of watching a woman and a child spend one more night out in the cold. 3 days passed before Thomas Hale finally came looking for his mother, and when he did, it was not out of concern but out of the practical inconvenience of a schedule disrupted, arriving at the Whitman doorstep with the brittle, over-rehearsed apology of a man who has convinced himself he did nothing wrong. He stood in Harold's doorway explaining that there had been a miscommunication about timing, that Sharon had assumed Dorothy was staying with her friend an extra night, that surely his mother understood how these things happened in a busy household. Dorothy listened to every word from the hallway behind Harold, and something in her, something that had spent decades excusing her son's smaller failures, finally refused to accept this larger one. Before we go further, let us know in the comments if you've ever had to stand up to someone in your own family. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what Harold discovers next. What Thomas did not expect, standing in that doorway, was Harold Whitman stepping forward with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had spent decades making far more powerful people than Thomas Hale extremely uncomfortable in far shorter conversations. Harold asked, in a tone that gave away nothing of what he already suspected, whether Thomas would be willing to provide his mother with copies of the trust documents she had signed 2 years earlier, simply so she could review them at her leisure now that she had a bit more free time on her hands. Thomas hesitated, just long enough for the hesitation itself to become its own kind of answer, before promising vaguely to have Sharon locate the paperwork, and Harold, watching him retreat down the walkway moments later, understood with total certainty that he had just watched a man buy himself time to hide something rather than time to find it. Dorothy did not return to the house that week, choosing instead to stay in the Whitmans' guest room with Lily, a decision that cost her more pride than she wanted to admit, but that she made anyway, because for the first time in months, she had woken up somewhere she did not feel like a burden. Lily had always been a watchful child, the kind of 8-year-old who noticed when adults changed the subject too quickly, and in the weeks she spent at the Whitmans' house, that watchfulness turned inward in ways that worried Carol more than the girl's quiet, good behavior ever reassured her. She stopped asking when they would go home. She began, instead, folding her clothes with an unusual precision each night, lining her shoes up perfectly beside the guest bed, as though keeping everything in order might somehow keep the rest of her world from slipping further out of place. Carol noticed this on the third night and sat with her at the edge of the bed, not offering false comfort, simply asking Lily what she was thinking about. Lily said only that she was trying to remember if she had said goodbye to her room before they left, and Carol, who had raised 3 children of her own through their own quiet griefs, understood that this was not really a question about a bedroom at all. It was Harold, of all people, who found the way to reach her, not through comfort, but through purpose. He noticed Lily watching him one afternoon as he reviewed papers at the dining table, and instead of shooing her away, he handed her a blank legal pad and asked, with the same seriousness he might have shown a junior colleague, whether she would help him organize dates into order, since his own eyes weren't what they used to be. Lily took the task with a solemnity that startled Carol from the next room, sorting papers by month with small, careful hands, and for the first time in nearly a week, she asked a question that had nothing to do with home at all. She asked Harold what a trust was, and Harold, choosing his words with the same care he had once used explaining complicated law to frightened clients, told her it was simply a promise someone made on paper, so that even after they were gone, the people they loved most would still be taken care of exactly the way they wanted. Lily considered this for a long moment before saying, quietly, that her grandfather must have made a very good promise, and Harold, surprised by how close to the truth she had landed without knowing any of the details yet, told her that he suspected she was exactly right. Word of what had happened moved through the neighborhood the way it always does in a place where people have known each other for decades, not through any single dramatic announcement, but through the small, ordinary rituals of shared life. Margaret Ostrander, who had lived across the street from the Hales for nearly as long as Dorothy had lived there herself, was the first to say anything out loud, cornering Carol gently by the mailboxes one morning and asking whether everything was all right over there. Carol, mindful of Dorothy's dignity, said only that Dorothy and Lily were staying with them for a while and that things were being sorted out. Margaret nodded slowly and began, from that morning on, walking her own trash bins out earlier than usual, timed carefully so she might cross paths with Dorothy on the sidewalk and offer a small, steady kindness that asked for nothing in return. Not everyone responded with the same grace. The Delacroix family, who had hosted the Hales at their annual summer barbecue for over a decade, quietly stopped inviting Thomas and Sharon that year, while extending an unusually warm welcome to Dorothy herself. Harold found himself fielding more conversations than he expected from neighbors asking, with studied casualness, whether it was true that Thomas had forged his own mother's signature, and he answered every time with the same measured discretion, telling them the matter was being handled appropriately and that Dorothy deserved to tell her own story in her own time. It was Reverend Alan Prescott, who had known both Walter and Dorothy since before Thomas was born, who ultimately did more than anyone else to reshape how people spoke about the family, visiting Dorothy quietly and later speaking to his congregation about the particular loneliness that can hide inside families that look whole from the outside, without naming anyone directly. More than one person left that service with a clearer conscience about how they intended to treat the Hales going forward. It was on the fifth night, unable to sleep, that Dorothy finally asked Carol to bring her the folder Walter had left behind, the one still sitting untouched in the hallway closet of a house she was no longer welcome inside. Carol, who had a spare key from years of watering the Hales' garden during vacations, made the short walk over in the dark without hesitation, letting herself in quietly while the house sat empty, and returned within the hour carrying the same worn folder Dorothy had avoided for the better part of a year, the words for Lily, only still visible in Walter's familiar handwriting across the front. Dorothy opened it that night at the Whitmans' kitchen table, her hands trembling not from cold this time, but from a fear she had been outrunning for months, and what she found inside was not what she expected. It was a formal legal document, dated 4 years before Walter's death, establishing a separate trust in Lily's name alone, naming Dorothy as sole guardian and trustee until Lily's 18th birthday, and specifying, in language even Dorothy could understand, that the house and the majority of Walter's remaining estate were never meant to pass through Thomas at all. Harold, reading over the document the following morning, explained to Dorothy exactly what her husband had quietly arranged years before his death, and why. This changed everything Dorothy believed about the trust paperwork she had signed 2 years earlier, urged along gently but persistently by Sharon, who had framed the new trust as a simple modernization of an outdated document. Harold's suspicion, confirmed within days through records he still had access to, was that the newer trust Dorothy had signed had quietly and unlawfully attempted to override Walter's original arrangement. The confrontation, when it finally came, took place not in anger but in the quiet, devastating clarity of undeniable paperwork laid across a kitchen table. Thomas sat in silence for a long moment, staring at documents that exposed not only what had been done, but who had likely done it, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the practiced apology from days earlier. He turned to Sharon, and in front of Dorothy, in front of Harold, he asked her directly whether she had forged his mother's signature, and the silence that followed answered the question more completely than any words could have. What broke Thomas that afternoon was not the fraud itself, but the letter Harold produced next, one Walter had written years earlier and left with his own attorney to be delivered only if the original trust was ever challenged. In it, Walter had written to his son directly, explaining that he loved him completely, that he forgave him for the money he had already quietly lost, but that he could not, in good conscience, leave his granddaughter's future in the hands of decisions made under financial desperation. He had written that he hoped, more than anything, that Thomas would never need to read this letter at all. Thomas read that letter twice at the kitchen table, his hands shaking by the second reading, and when he finally looked up at his mother, the anger Dorothy had braced herself for was entirely absent from his face. What remained instead was something closer to grief. He did not defend himself. He simply asked her, quietly, whether there was any way to undo what had been done. Sharon did not leave the marriage all at once. She lingered for several more weeks, staying in a house that had grown unbearably quiet, watching Thomas move through his days with a new, careful gentleness toward his mother that Sharon found she could not match. She came to Dorothy once during those final weeks, unannounced, standing at the edge of the porch where it had all begun, and said, without her usual composure, that she had convinced herself for so long that she was protecting the family's future that she had stopped noticing whose future she was actually protecting. She admitted, in the plainest words she had used in months, that she had grown up in a house where money disappeared quietly and without explanation, and that somewhere along the way she had decided the only way to protect herself from repeating that story was to control everything she could get her hands on first. Dorothy did not accept the apology, but she did not turn away from it either, telling Sharon only that fear did not excuse what it justified. Sharon left the house 2 weeks later with 2 suitcases and an apology to Lily that came out smaller and more awkward than she had intended. The deposition took place in a conference room Dorothy had passed 100 times in her life, without ever once imagining she would sit inside it under these circumstances. Harold sat beside her, and a younger attorney named Patricia Ames handled the formal filing, walking Dorothy through what to expect. The opposing attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch hired hastily by Sharon, pressed Dorothy on whether it was her own carelessness that had created the confusion, rather than any wrongdoing on his client's part. It was Patricia who interjected calmly, reminding Fitch that his client's handwriting analysis, not Dorothy's memory, would be the deciding factor. The handwriting analyst, Dr. Foster, walked the room through her findings with the thoroughness of someone who had testified in exactly this kind of dispute for 30 years, projecting enlarged images of Dorothy's signature beside the signature on the modified document, pointing out the subtle but consistent differences that revealed a forgery attempted by someone familiar with the original but not practiced enough to replicate its more subtle habits. It was during a recess in that hearing that Sharon approached Dorothy near the elevators, saying she hoped Dorothy understood none of it had ever been about hatred, only about a fear so large that Sharon had convinced herself controlling the paperwork was the same thing as controlling the future. Dorothy told her only that she hoped, for Sharon's own sake, that she found a way to be honest with herself before this pattern cost her something she could not get back a second time. The formal ruling came 3 weeks later, delivered through a quiet letter from the court. The judge had found the modified trust invalid, reinstating Walter's original trust in full, naming Dorothy sole guardian of Lily's inheritance and rightful resident of the house. There was no punishment beyond the civil finding itself, a decision Dorothy herself had requested, telling Harold plainly that she wanted her family whole again more than she wanted anyone punished. When Dorothy hung up the phone that afternoon, she simply sat for a long while at the kitchen table, feeling something closer to exhaustion than triumph. It was Lily, arriving home from school, who finally asked whether it was good news, and Dorothy, pulling her granddaughter into her lap, told her simply that they were going home. That rebuilding did not happen quickly, and Dorothy did not pretend otherwise. It happened instead in a long series of ordinary Sundays, the first of which Thomas spent almost entirely in silence, unsure what words could possibly follow an apology that felt too small. Dorothy did not fill that silence for him. By the third Sunday, Thomas began bringing small, practical gestures instead of words, fixing a loose hinge on the back door, replacing a cracked window pane in the sewing room. It was on the 6th Sunday that he finally brought Lily with him for the whole afternoon, and Dorothy watched from the kitchen window as her son knelt in the garden beside his daughter, teaching her the names of flowers Walter had planted decades earlier, and something in Dorothy's chest loosened for the first time in months. By the time Dorothy formally returned to the house, the neighborhood's relationship to the family had shifted in ways that would linger for years. Margaret Ostrander was among the first to bring a casserole to the house the week Dorothy moved back in, standing on the porch beneath the newly reliable light and telling her, simply, that she was glad to see her home. Lily, through all of it, remained the quiet center holding everyone together. She began spending Sunday afternoons again in her grandmother's sewing room. And it was there, months later, that Dorothy finally told her the full story of the folder her grandfather had left behind. Lily asked only one question. She asked whether her grandfather had known, all those years ago, that she would need protecting. There was one evening, nearly a year after the storm, when Dorothy found Lily sitting alone on the front porch steps at dusk, watching the motion sensor light above her flicker once, and then hold steady against the gathering dark. Dorothy sat down beside her, and after a long while, Lily asked whether Dorothy had been scared that night. Really scared. Dorothy told her the truth, that she had been more frightened that night than she had been in years, of the possibility that the love she had built her whole life around might not have been real after all. And then she told Lily what she had learned since, that the love had been real after all, just buried for a while, and that sometimes the truest measure of love is not whether people get it right every time, but whether they are willing to do the difficult work of making it right once they understand what it cost. Lily leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder, watching the porch light hold steady above them both, and said only that she was glad the light worked now. Dorothy laughed, a real laugh, and told her that she was glad of that too. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments how it made you feel, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like Dorothy's.